You cannot think yourself out of overthinking. And with that, we continue here with the daily yap, where I talk for 10 minutes about random topics and then just cut off the video after that time. So when we think about thinking, they're actually, I find this really interesting because obviously most of what the yaps are a push to get you to think. However, what is the reason to think might be to learn, and what it means to learn is to change your way of behavior so that something different might happen. There's a bunch of different sort of quotes that come to mind. One of them is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That's insanity, right? That's the first quote that comes to mind. The second thing that sort of comes to mind is that worrying is like wishing for something bad to happen. This sort of connects to this overthinking, right? Because I'm trying to sort of lay out a plan of like, okay, you're thinking, but like just thinking it's not going to do anything. And that's also why worry doesn't work. Because when you worry, like worrying, you're projecting yourself to the future and you're like, okay, this bad thing could happen, or this bad thing could happen, or this bad thing could happen. And what ends up happening is none of those things, like not even close, like 99% of the time. And the reason why the sort of thought of overthinking and the sort of action versus thought came to mind is I started listening to, as an audiobook, / reading the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. And I am like super, like very, very, I'm not far into the book. Let me rephrase it. I'm not very far into the book because, oh my God, that is that's a dense book. I've read like other philosophy that I've been able to like follow much easier. That's a bit of a crazy one. But the reason why it was so interesting is because I was interested in, I mean, number one, sort of the golden mean, as it means for the virtue and like how to basically live a good life, I guess. And it was always interesting and attractive to me that instead of, let's say, the way that virtue is defined in the Christian tradition is basically like there's a virtue and a vice and that's it, right? So you get the idea of either you are greedy or you're charitable. Those are the two sides of the coin. Whereas in virtue ethics for Aristotle, the generosity sits in the middle. Stinginess is a deficiency of generosity, and extravagance might be an excess of generosity. And I think that's, in my opinion, that is a better framework, because anything done in excess is also bad, right? Another example would be courage. If you have a deficiency of courage, you're a cowardice. If you have an excess of courage, you have rashness, right? Like you're doing something, like you're just, I mean, you're not thinking about anything that you're doing, which would also be bad. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And that's why I started reading the book or listening to the audiobook. But one thing that stuck out to me there was very early on, I think a third chapter, there was one thing where where Aristotle talked about the study of moral philosophy / political science. It depends on what translation you take. But the idea is that basically he says that young men are not fit for the study of moral philosophy because they have no experience in the actions of life. And I think that's really interesting. And I've written down a part of this, and the reasoning he gives is fascinating. He says that because feelings rule his life and directs all his desires, men of this character turn the knowledge they get to no account in practice, as we see with these that we call incontinent. And I find that absolutely fascinating. So the idea being that when you learn something new, so you study something, let's just suppose, and I think that this is giving me a little bit too credit, but let's just say that watching these yaps, you learn something, right? This is a study, just for the sake of argument, please. And what is the end of listening to this? Or the end of studying? Or the end of learning? Well, it is to learn something, okay. But what does it mean to have learned something? In theory, that means that you now have a new nugget of knowledge. And with that nugget of knowledge, you turn that into action. And not just having knowledge for knowledge's sake. Because this doesn't do anything. So to sort of end the quote from a different translation though, that would be for to them that are such the knowledge comes to be unprofitable as to those of imperfect self-control. This would be the ones that we call incontinent. But to those who form their desires and act in accordance with reason, to have knowledge on these points must be very profitable. That means that if I have understood this correctly, and I've tried to look at multiple different translations here, the true learning only comes through action. And now we get full circle from the thinking cannot get you out of overthinking, and worrying is like wishing something bad would happen. Both of these things occupy the plane of pure thinking. You're always in thought. No. Do something, do anything. Action will get you out of a funk way easier. You can't think yourself out of a funk, or you can't think yourself out of a rut, right? When you're in a rut, I've been in ruts, my whole life, there's been periods where you're just in a rut, where you're just like, oh, something's just, bleh. Literally do anything that's could be an improvement of like 0.1%. It sounds really stupid, but maybe it works. Take a shower. Sit down with a tea and just literally just stare at a wall. Even that's doing something, because you're not thinking. Just do anything. Do anything, do anything, do anything. Take a walk. And I think that's a interesting one. No, but this is it's a very interesting thing to consider, that the goal of acquiring knowledge should be action in the end. Alex Hormozy said that intelligence is basically same stimuli, different output. And I think that's a great way to sort of think about or consider what intelligence is. Let's say, I'm going to relate this to a gaming example, because then I know my audience, okay? I'm going to get you with this. When you're playing Dark Souls and you fight the last boss, I've not beaten Dark Souls, so don't, okay? Anyway, you fight a boss in Dark Souls, okay? And you don't learn the patterns. You just do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. They go back to, once again, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Now, when you are in a video game and you're like, oh, I just have to learn the pattern. Yes, that's not only in a video game. That's in life too. Literally, you just have to learn the pattern and then behave differently when that pattern arises again. And all of a sudden, you have, quote unquote, solved life. Obviously, it's more complicated than this. But when you think about it, that's basically it, right? That's basically it. You take a certain thing, a certain, whatever it might be in a certain event, and then you're like, okay, I've acted like this in that way. Oh, that's not quite right. Maybe I should change this up a little bit. And then you refine this over time. And I think that's also why Aristotle says that the young person lacks real-world experience. Because you can't... Something here has to be learned by experience, right? It's learning by doing. I don't know. I find this very interesting. I don't know if all of these things even connect to each other in a coherent way, or if this is just sort of my own delusion in this case. I just found this absolutely fascinating. And I think there's something there. I think there's a nugget in there. I will probably have to redefine this a little bit more. But maybe this was useful to you. If it was, I would really I would appreciate any sort of feedback in the comments below or a like. Otherwise, I will talk to you again in the next Yap tomorrow. Until then.